Good afternoon, folks, and welcome into the Takeup. Glad to have you guys here for this Education Friday. And this topic that, though it may seem a little dry to some folks, is something that we deal with quite a lot, and certainly something that I've had to cover quite a bit because people have issues with files and file management and file types. So, embroidery file management misconceptions. Why I call it this? Because sometimes people really do kind of get themselves sideways about what they should do with files, what types of files are for what purpose, how they should save them, how they should save space. And certainly, we're not just going to talk about that because of some of the questions that got brought up in a previous episode recently that concerned file ownership and production. I'm also going to talk about a little bit about backup and a little bit about providing a style guide process and program setup as a product. So your digitized file and your process to some degree and sampling as a product, and just a little bit about how I used to do that for clients who wanted to have their embroidery files and wanted to have them released. So like a file release package. So I'll talk just a little bit about that and the hows and whys thereabouts. But in general, we're just going to have a light, fairly short conversation, I think about file management misconceptions, how we handle our files, how we handle backups and savings, things like that, and just a little bit about file types and what they're good for. So here's hoping that everybody kind of enjoys that. That's something you want. I had lots of questions in this last week about file types and file setups, so I think it's something that's still worthwhile to cover, even if it is a bit of a drier topic than shading, the other fun stuff that we do. Like I said, there will be more digitizing topics soon and more guests soon. But in the meantime, I thought this is something worthwhile, especially considering so many people have so many uh, little confusing questions and so many things that cause them to have issues with things like uh, what is a working file? What is a stitch file? What information is held therein? What should I be saving? How can I save space? Why are certain files larger than others? And how should I handle, like I said, backups and the cloud? Because that's another thing that would be kind of troublesome is this new, and I would say new, yes, it's not very new, but the relatively new sort of integration of cloud based file sync on everybody's computers, which can get you kind of a false sense of security as far as what the difference is with file sync and a backup. So, like I said, not a long show, not a large show, probably, and certainly some of you folks who want to get in on the digitizing stuff, we will do more of the digitizing and drawing. What I will say is, by all means, if you have a question specifically related to design creation, digitizing the creative side of this thing, leave me those questions, comment with those questions, send them into the contact page at ericcampbell.com, and that's what's most likely to get covered first. But like I said, we've got some guests lined up eventually. I'm still trying to work out dates with everybody, and certainly some more digitizing content, design analysis content, production content. But for today, we're going to go ahead and stick with embroidery file management misconceptions. And like I said, it really is a lot about those topics we often handle as far as file types, storage, and how they're handled. And also best practices for saving while you're digitizing too. That's another thing I'm going to talk about briefly, which my good friend Lisa Shaw has a good phrase about that I will say here shortly. You'll hear me repeat quite a bit, honestly, if you're on this show for any period of time. So before we do that, though, I do want to let you guys know that I was recently on another podcast. You guys may or may not know that I sometimes do interviews for other podcasts. So before I go into what we're going to talk about for the show, I'm actually going to give you guys a link to another show because I had some people ask about this who already noticed it out there. I had the great fortune of being interviewed by the good folks over at the Apparelist. So Cassie Green and Christine Shreve, who you guys may or may not know yourselves, interviewed me for their episode 52 of their Threads of Change podcast. And we talked all about apparel industry education and fostering the next generation, stuff like that. If you want to hear me talk a little bit about that, is edited down from the conversation we had. So not everything I wanted to say got on there, but certainly quite a lot of what I wanted to say got on there and mentioned. If you want to hear more about my take on why we do education, classes, things like that, what we should be doing, who are stewards for the embroidery industry and the craft, and how you might want to get into education and make yourself a voice that is heard out there, you can go ahead and check out this podcast as well. And I'll go ahead and throw up a QR code if you want to catch that. But in the comments here, I will also grab the actual link for you. If you head over to the Apparelist website right now, it should be there. But we'll go ahead and throw that up in the comments as well for you guys if you want to see it. Uh, that podcast is up, and it is an audio only podcast, though there is also a copy on YouTube if you just want to use YouTube as your player of choice. It does exist, but certainly you can grab that as well. So I'll go ahead and share my second screen here so you can see as well. That is where what we're looking at. We're a para list, and that's the threads of change. You can just listen to it in the browser, or you can, like I said, check that out on YouTube or your other player of choice. But thought I'd go ahead and let you guys know about that. I'd love to promote when folks are good enough to bring me on for different projects and such. But really had a great conversation with Cassie and Christine. So it was really interesting and something that's worthwhile if you are like me, someone who's interested in teaching, education, and also like I said, inroads for people who haven't been educating up to this point. So kind of interesting stuff. It was kind of cool. Anyway, before we go on to the rest of our topic, let's go ahead and say hi to the folks who are here live. We've got quite a few folks who've shown up. So you guys, you reciprocators who are in here live and listening, you know, I like to talk to you folks. But if you're on the replay squad, by all means, hit fast forward, get on to the next section, and that's fine by me. I'll throw the banner back up when we get back to topic. But for now, I'd like to say hi to folks. We got Cindy King out in Texas saying good afternoon. Got Doug out in California, Doug Sobel saying hi to everybody. Everybody talking to each other. We have Janice saying hi. Hi, Janice. Happy to have you here. We have Marta saying hello from Texas. Happy to have you in as well. And we've got Chuck coming in as well. Hey, Chuck. Frank's got to go, but hey, Frank catches on the replay. No big deal. Hope you have a great weekend, Frank. Always a wonderful supporter out there in the UK of everything we do in the embroidery world. We have my compatriot over in Embrilliance, Lisa Shaw, who's saying good afternoon to everybody. Got Jesse, who's a great commenter, also often on the replay squad, saying hi. Hi, Jesse. Happy to have you in. We have lots of other folks jumping in. Apparently, Frank he's committing to the replay. You don't have to, man, if you don't need to, but I appreciate it. Thanks for catching the replay. We've got Barb showing up saying, hi, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone from North Central Minnesota. Hope you're doing all right out there. Certainly what I'm going to say these days is I am feeling the humidity. Hopefully everybody else who's either back east like I am now or out up in the north is doing all right. Because frankly, humidity is getting me today. I'm just going to say this. So hopefully you guys are doing okay. Everybody in the Midwest is also doing all right. We're under a heat advisory and it's raining. It is like 80 odd degrees and rain here in Pennsylvania where I am. And yeah, it's like going outside in body temperature water. It's a little weird. It's a little more than I'm good for. So if you see me unbuttoning the old shirt more often these days, then you're going to notice, or the sound of my air conditioner, I certainly apologize, but you're probably going to have to put up with it for a little while. Anyway, got some other folks who are jumping in, which I love. Love to see you guys talking to each other, which is great. And then Cindy says, I got to visit with Christine last week in an Applique getaway. Yeah, I'm glad you got to do that. Always great to get with our community. And honestly, community is such a big part of that podcast we talked about, too. Love to see it. Wendy is in saying, hey there. Hey, Wendy. Happy to have you in. And Jesse says, I never fast forward. That is very nice of you. Listening to us banter with everybody. That's lovely. Doug says, yeah, I had dinner with Christine and Impressions at Long Beach along with Eric. This is true. We all had dinner across the street from the Long Beach show at Impressions. It was a good time. And Cindy got to meet Marta last weekend, too. Awesome. Very cool. Love to see people talking. Lisa apparently commiserating with me so far. So, yeah, that sounds miserable. Yeah, it is just, it's like walking around in somebody's mouth. I don't know. It is not pleasant right now. The humidity is hard for this desert guy to handle. I'm going to quit complaining about everything. I got to try and not be such a moaner, but I got to say it is more than I was ready for. That is for sure. And Doug says, that's why I love California weather. Yeah, I don't know, man. The desert does have some lovely things to offer. I'm not going to lie. It will crisp up your skin. It will burn the contacts out of your eyes. And we walk outside and end up with weather that feels like a hairdryer is blowing in your face. But at the same time, I am much more attuned to that than I am to this intense humidity out here. I am just sticking to the world today. I'll tell you that. But still, lovely. It was a lovely time. So, lovely time out there today. Lovely area. The weather is nice sometimes. The greenery is always beautiful. And I'll say this. I had to find something. I was like, you know what? I'm going to quit complaining because I know I get to grumping about the weather. What I'm going to say about Northeast Pennsylvania, I have never seen more beautiful wildflowers in this kind of content quality, like the bulb-based flowers, the gladiolus and all that just popping up everywhere and lilies everywhere. I've never seen so much of that. So it's very beautiful. But that's something I was like, All right, man, try to salvage something. What do you love out here? Like I said, when the weather's like this, I got to look for something to love. All right. Cindy also said hi to Wendy too. It was Wendy's first year to own Applegate Getaway. She did a fantastic job. Well, all right. I'm glad. Yeah, glad you had a good time out there. Right? Yeah, it's shows are always wonderful. Getting to be with the people who kind of get you to vibe with your tribe, as it were, is always a nice thing. And getting to be around other folks who are in the embroidery world who understand both what you're going through and what you love is something that is priceless, no matter how you do it, including being here on the show. All right, so without further ado, why don't we get back to the topic at hand? Like I said, maybe a little drier topic. I will go ahead and say ahead of time, not that you guys wouldn't anyway, but I absolutely invite you guys to ask questions, to jump in with commentary. If you have questions about embroidery file issues, about the way files work, about something that you have trouble with with managing files or organizing files or sending files, or whatever it is, I would love to see those. I may not answer all of them as we get through this today, but if you have stuff you want to talk about live, by all means, that's why I do this as a live show and not generally as a pre-recorded piece. So yeah, jump in, ask questions, but first, let's just go ahead and set a couple of things up ahead of time before we get too far. Though I have one more comment from Lisa Shaw. I got to grab this one. She says, yes, the gardens and flowers are beautiful. Back to file management and saving. 100% back to it. But yeah, gardens are beautiful. But yeah, let's get onto the files. Suffice it to say, yeah, let's talk about the first thing that I think stymies the most people. I know you folks here who are with me generally are going to understand this stuff, but if you are not somebody who digitizes all the time, or maybe you are just starting out your embroidery career, this is the thing that causes you probably some of the most trouble. And in fact, I find it causes trouble with our clients as well. So it's interesting to define these things and to kind of give ourselves some concepts for them. And that's the working file versus a stitch file. And no matter what embroidery software you use, this is always the case, that working files and stitch files are not only different, but have very different things that you're going to do with them. The working file is the file in which you digitize, the file that has the object created within it. So if we're talking about working file versus stitch file, the working file is not only the digitizing file, it is in the native format of the software where you're working in. If, like me, you're working in Stitch Artist, that is going to be a .be file. If you are working in something like, if you're working in Wilcom, it's going to be a .emb file. Back in the day, I used to use Pulse back far enough. Certainly, they are now, I believe, PXF files is still the Pulse file. But I do remember very distinctly when they had an outline file and a stitch file separately saved, which is the POF file. And there's multitude of them. There's also the ones from like Design Shop and the rest. But primarily for me, I'm now working in .be files. These files do, however, have the vector-like objects with which we define areas of stitching and in which we work. So that's the working file. The stitch file is the stitch formatted file, the formatted file that is used to translate to your machine. It is the file that the machine reads and generally contains none of the objects. There are exceptions, very small exceptions that nobody here is actually going to worry about. Nobody here with a modern machine is worrying about like old school Melco Starlet machines that had a condensed file that it was translating on the fly. That's not the case anymore. Now, just about every machine is going to have a stitch file that is used to translate out to the machine format. The classic winner and champion of general files that are used for everybody is still the .dst Tajima formatted file. Frankly, yes, it's a Tajima format. Yes, it became kind of the generic. It became it's the Kleenex problem. The Tajima file became the file for everybody. Yes, there are many more files out there. In the home embroidery world, I do see tons of Brother PES files used in a very similar way as the DST file, used as almost a lingua franca. But at the same time, every machine may require its own format, but they often will support the .dst machine file. The stitch file, though, the stitch file or the machine file only is going to contain literal stitch coordinates generally. Now, some of these have more or less information. Usually it is stitch coordinates. It is stitch codes. So codes to, depending on your stitch format file, it'll do different things, but mostly for color stops. So we can stop and change to another color. And even then, some of the codes, people think, oh, there's trim codes. If we're talking about DST, it does not have trim codes. What it has is jump stitch codes, codes where we don't drop the needle. And trims are indicated by stacking multiple non-movement jumps. So 3 jumps in the same area without moving the needle or more, depending on how you set up your software and how your machine is set up, will just trigger the machine to know, hey, we haven't moved and we haven't put the needle down for 3 jump stitches, for 3 stitches, 3 movements. We need to go ahead and trim now. This is the time for us to fire the trimmers. So stitch files have a very basic subset, and when we're down to DST, they don't even have color formatting. So no color information as to what color is going on, which colors stop on a DST file. Certainly all the home formats are going to have some version. PES has limited colors depending on what version of PES the old formats do. But as we go further on, they have color information as well. But they don't have, and critically what they don't have, is the object-based information in the working file. The vector-like shapes and or things like text setups when we are using fonts. Those lettering objects that contain all of the information for lettering and allow us to edit that lettering are not contained inside of the stitch file. So that's the thing to understand. Do I need to necessarily show you this? No, but what the hey, we've got we've got Embrilliance rolling, and I've got a logo that I digitized in Stitch Artist. You could definitely digitize this logo in Stitch Artist too. I did so using a Stitch Artist 3 setup as is here, but it would not be necessary to be in 3. So I have a version of Stitch Artist where I can change through the versions. This is an education thing. This is not something you will be having. So if you see me changing my toolbar, this is to show you different versions. This is Stitch Artist 2 that you're looking at right now with these level of tools that are up here on the toolbar. That is not something you will have, so don't worry about those moving around. If I accidentally do that and change those up, that's what's going on. But what you're seeing here are the tools of Stitch Artist 2, but the thing that's interesting here for us to understand, at least as we're looking at the Brilliance file format, it is very similar in other softwares where we'll have an object list or something like that over on the right-hand side. In this case, you can see over here in the right-hand side. Let me see if I can get pointer focus to fire off today. So we can actually see the pointer a little bit better. Well, hopefully we can get that to run. If it does not run, which it may not today, I've been having problems with pointer focus recently. Let's see if we can get that to run. If it runs, I'll have a little bit better pointer. If I don't, I won't. But suffice it to say, yeah, we'll see over here. I don't think pointer focus is going to run correctly. You can still see me kind of jiggling the mouse around over here on the right-hand side, and I'll scroll up down so you can see the items moving. The working file is going to contain objects, and these individual objects will have all of the settings in these individual objects. Let's say here in the properties menu that we have down here on the bottom right-hand side, looking at Stitch Artist, but in whatever software you have, you will have some sort of properties pane, some sort of slider or bar that contains the properties so that when you select an object, you can change the properties of that block of stitching in order to change stitch types, densities, underlay, if you're using automatic underlay types, underlay settings, inset, things like that. Those are all available through your working file and through these individual objects. Now, what I'm going to show you, this text down here, this text is not in a font. This is actually custom digitized text, so it's not going to have a lettering object, but if we did have a lettering object, as we certainly could here, we could start a lettering object and just make something happen with it. I don't know where it's up in the middle of my giant hoop that I was using for showing this piece. I'll just go ahead and delete that. The lettering object, once again, very much like other objects, and I'll zoom in on it, is going to have all of these settings over here on the bottom right where we can change lettering, and I can change what sort of type I have there. I can insert different names. I can do whatever you want to do. That is all going to be in the working file. So if you are in the Embrilliance world, that's going to be your .be file. If you are somewhere else, it may vary. Like I said, if you are in Wilcom, it's going to be a .emb file. That's your working file, right? If you're talking about a stitch file, this logo, I did output this to a regular stitch file. It actually does have 2 colors in it. It's got a separated color for the School of Medicine text so that you can use different colors in that if you want to. And in this case, I have this on a DST. So the DST file does not encode for color. It did not save those colors because this is a straight Tajima DST file. What you're going to notice immediately over here on the right-hand side in the objects pane is that all you have is each grouping of stitches, each color stop. You do not have anything else. You do not have any object information. And if you are here in Brilliance, even if we select this as an object, we can select this individual object. And because we do have software that will allow us to do processing stitch by stitch, I do have some things where I can adjust satin and fill, but these are processing. When I mess with any sort of density or processing in this, or if I'm in another software where I process this into objects by allowing it to recognize those stitches and it tries to make objects out of them, it's not the same as the original digitized objects. And if this were a font, there would be no way for me to type in this text down here or to use that font. I can't change anything about it. These are now just stitches. How these exist, what these are, they are not an object. It is a color stop. That is all I have here is a color stop and all the stitches that are within said color stop. All I really have access to now are those individual stitches or any stop codes. I can change colors or I can do things that are essentially file editing. I now am into stitch file editing. If I want to add a color stop, I'm going to have to do things like literally either lasso. If I've got Embroidery Enthusiast, I can lasso, or even in if I'm in Essentials, I can go through and say, all right, I want the last row of text to have a different color. I'm going to have to go through here and separate this out. And in this case, because the rows of text are separated in a different way, I'm actually going to have to make two different color stops. I'll have to stop here at this L because of the sequence in which the words were done. And I think this is actually an accident of me outputting this before I was done editing. I will have to then drop in a manual color stop. Here, if I was in, like I said, here in Embrilliance, I can go to this little color stop button here and insert a stop. And then I can select another color. In this case, I was using the palettes. I could use a thread color and just grab any thread color to insert my next stop so I can see what I'm doing. I'll just put a wild color that it wasn't already in there. Put a chartreuse in here. Then I have inserted a color stop, and now you'll see over on the right-hand side that I have another color stop. But this is not accessing the digitized objects. I can't change density without using processing or some other stitch-based process that is not the original. I can't change stitch types in this format. I can't add or remove underlay aside from selecting it and tearing it out, and then I'm going to have jump stitches when I do that. I cannot increase the inset on the underlay. I can't do anything with the parameters of these stitches. What's fairly easy to do is to delete entire blocks, to move an entire stitch block around in the relative space. Fairly easy to do. I can move around a full like color stop. I can do that. But if I want to do anything with changing colors or breaking up how the colors are done, or if I have to recolor just a segment of design, I'm now stuck selecting things, going through and finding in the sequence where I can put a color stop or anything of that nature, because this is the stitch file. Whereas if I were here with my original objects, I could very easily, number one, resequence this stuff and say, all right, I need to get all of the in medicine here, and those actually need to go at the end of this cycle. I could go through, now these are all grouped, so I'd have to ungroup these first. But yeah, you can go through and select those and certainly move that around differently. I could grab those and say, all right, I want all of these at the end of the sequence instead of having something else after them, which is what I have on this case back and forth. You could do that. You could resequence, you can work on those. And as you can tell, if I zoom in here and I say, all right, I think that underlay is a little too close to the edge, I can go in here in the digitizing settings on this particular piece, go to my underlay. And once I'm in my underlay, I can actually, or not my pull comp, my underlay. And I can increase things like this inset and make it further away from the edge, as you can see. That's the stuff we can do with our working file. We cannot do that with our stitch file. And one of the biggest problems I see people having when they're very, very new is that they not only kind of don't get this working file versus stitch file dichotomy, they are so keen on saving particular files down to the smallest available space. And I think this is coming from a time when storage was a lot more expensive, or from folks who have very small drives on their home computers, I'm assuming is what they're doing, or they're trying to reduce their backup sizes. They try and get rid of the excess files. And so frequently enough, they're literally creating things in the working file, and then they're saving out their stitch files and then deleting the working file. The first thing I'm going to say, number one, and I don't feel like I need to tell you guys this. I mean, I'm going to talk about file saving in a whole different way for digitizers in a moment. But if I can't believe I have to say this, don't ever delete your working file from storage. Not only don't delete your working file, if you make multiple versions, I'm going to talk about in a minute, save all the versions. File storage is relatively cheap. And I'll tell you in a moment one of the things that can clog up your storage or make your files really, really large. But file storage is relatively cheap. Save the working file always, because if I'm having problems with my underlay popping out and I delete my working file, I can't go back in and adjust the underlay settings. If I'm having problems with coverage and I want to increase density, though there are ways to process density, and with something simple that has like satin stitches like this for in Brilliance, we do have a very lovely stitch processor that Brian wrote underneath this thing that will allow you to alter densities on satin stitches. Not all stitch types are going to be able to respond that way, and certainly there's a ton of stitch types that you really can't alter that way. And the other big thing about this too is when we're talking about scaling, if I were to do something where I've got any sort of straight stitch detail, when you expand, even with stitch processing on a design that has straight stitch detail, running stitch detail, or manual stitches, the stitches just get bigger. If you have the original digitized file, because that drawn line has a setting for the stitch length on it, when you expand the design, it regenerates the stitches and they will maintain the stitch length even though you blow them up. So if you blow up a design by 50% that had a 2 millimeter stitch length and you do this using stitch processing with stitch file, even if the densities are okay on the stitch types you use and it doesn't cause any panics for the processor, you are going to get 1.5 millimeter, or you're going to get an extra millimeter stitches. Instead of 2 millimeter stitches, are going to be 3 millimeter stitches when you go up that extra half of the design size. You're going to end up making your stitches longer and they'll look a little looser and they might not look the same. Whereas if you take that same design that has those running stitches in them and then expand it on the original file, though the digitizing may vary because you might have not made your objects in a certain way to have all the detail you want, along a line of stitching, running stitching, those will regenerate and they'll be 2 millimeters just like you set them up in the original digitized file. Because that's the thing, this is not vector lines that are then generating stitches when we are in the stitch file. It is the coordinates where the needle drops. That's what's inside of the stitch file. So like I said, I know many of you didn't need to know that again, but it's just something to remember at all times. The working file is the lifeblood of anyone who wants to ever edit something again. If you ever going to need to change, or you're going to reuse any element of it, or add anything or remove anything from a file, by all means, you want that working file. And bar none, you always want the working file. And frankly, if someone's digitizing for you and they're willing to give you the working file, much as many of us have not been over the years, take it. The working file, even if you can't open it in your software, is still kind of like the file of record that will have within it. Within that working file will be saved stitch colors the digitizer was using, at least in the software, even if they weren't the final colors perhaps they put on the machine. It will have the settings encoded within it. It will have stitch types encoded within it. And if you have the software that the working file goes to, let's say you do have someone digitize for you in Stitch Artist and you are using Stitch Artist, when you open it, you can make alterations to the original objects and to the original settings. So the working file is gold and you're always going to want that. So when we are concerned about our file storage or our file size, the last thing I ever want to hear people say is, oh man, the working files are big. I'm going to delete those since I have a file that runs really well. I'm not going to have to do something else with it. It's extremely short-sighted. And also, just because you have a file that works really well for polo shirts or for hats or whatever you're working on, you may want to use those objects again in a file that works on a different substrate. You're working on, flat garments right now that are lovely poplin shirts, but you're going to work on a knit sweatshirt someday. You're probably going to want to change some settings as far as pull compensation, underlay, and density that you can't change if you toss out your working file. So don't ever, ever, ever throw away your working file. I mean, like I said, I know I'm hammering on that, but the number of times people have said that out loud in a group, and I feel the need to run in and scream. I feel like I have to say that today. So like I said, it is, there are reasons why you might want to have that go on. Now, I will say this. I've got a comment real quick with Doug that is an interesting question here. He asks, are we better off using the proprietary stitch file our machine uses? When you are outputting to the machine, usually it's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference if you're not encoding anything important to the machine and it's just regular stitches and color changes. However, there are file formats that are going to allow you to get a little more utility out of the machine. Certainly, everybody knows that the modern home file formats do have colors assigned to them, meaning that even if it's not the thread color you're going to use eventually on the machine, if it's not the real thread color you have in stock, you have a correct colored version of it on any sort of preview on your LCD when you bring it up. Some file formats, some of the newer file formats for commercial machines do have some of that. The other thing you might find is that there are transfer file formats that not all software is going to output. Sometimes you end up using transfer software in between your digitizing software and the software that you're going to use. And those formats can have additional functions in them. The problem with that is if there is such a thing that they have additional functions, not all software will necessarily be able to access those functions. But some of those are interesting and could be valuable too. Like I know the ZSK transfer format has like head switching and other stuff. For most of us, almost any time of day, we're not going to have to worry about that. And most designs aren't going to take advantage of things like head switching or needle assignments are not very common. So if your stitch file has that, and I'll be honest and say I don't know. Off the top of my head, I haven't seen the latest spec for Barrett stitch files. And frankly, when I was running Barrettons and Tajimas myself, which is mostly what I ran, Barrettons, Tajimas, and way back in the day, Brother commercials. So commercial Brother machines, if you haven't seen them, they are metal machines that look a lot more like a Tajima than they do like a Brother home machine back in the day. When I was running those machines, and certainly the most of my machines were Tajimas and also, like I said, Barrett machines, none of those had any specialty format that would encode like needle positioning or anything. But you also have to remember that the Barrettons I ran were old. And the Tajimas I ran were not that old, but they're older than the current generation that are out there. And we just within the last few years got a new Tajima file format that does have color information. Your mileage may vary as to how important you think that is. I don't know. For me, it doesn't bother me too much to assign needles at the machine. And frankly, usually I'm not going to get the right colors compared to if I was sourcing this digitizing from somewhere else, I may not get the right colors from that digitizing or stock. And then I wouldn't worry too much about that, about like getting the right colors in the file. Though, once again, I'm going to fully admit to all of you, because of my background in working in machines that now might be considered kind of almost like headless machines, they didn't have a display on them. You loaded up files and you set your needle positions, and that was it. There was not a display that showed you the hoop area on the machine. Non-display machines were the most common for me back in the day when I first started. I have a comfortability with setting things up without seeing them on the screen that not everybody's going to have. That's just true. I will still say that generally using DST files, I would not probably bother to take a DST file, color a DST file in a special way, then go to the machine with it and use it like that. If I was digitizing for myself and I had the ability to set colors and needle assignments and I had a common needle assignment, maybe. In a shop where we changed threads on the needles fairly frequently and we only had a few needles that stayed in place, every time I started a design or a job, I'd have to go over, assign the needles anyway that weren't in the same standard colors, and they probably wouldn't be as useful to me. Besides the shops that I worked at, the kind of work we did that was highly customized per client and generally had colors that were not going to be universal for all clients, no. If I had a shop where a lot of my stuff was, let's say, spiritware for the same 2-3 schools, and most of my machine head was loaded up with those colors, and I had the ability to set it up with the needle assignments, I'd think about that, but it's not something I would consider like a super necessary part of setting up my files. Still, like I said, little bits of efficiency are good if you've got them. So if you have a machine that does it and the kind of work you do supports that, why not? Why do that if you can, or if you use transfer software in the middle of your other software post creation if you don't have that file format. Let's say this way: if I didn't have that in software that was easy to access, I probably wouldn't stress about opening it up in another piece of software and recoloring and creating that transfer file, unless I was doing something like the ZSKs have, where they can select heads, and maybe I'm doing some special team naming or multimedia or something else where it really does change the efficiency of the run. And even then, I'd have to ask myself how much it changed the efficiency of the run, depending on my minimum run size and what kind of designs I was doing. So yeah, I know, non-answer, but there you go. that's the answer. It might sound like a non-answer, but that's what it is. All right, so let's go into a little bit of just what costs as far as storage space for folks, and then I'll talk a little bit about backup stuff as well before we kind of move on to the preparing of a file packet for a project or product. But let's go ahead and start with what costs in storage space. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is embroidery files are relatively small. It's not that they are all entirely small, and I'm going to tell you what makes them usually balloon up, but especially stitch files. If I generated different stitch files for a job, let's say that I had individual stitch files for a like team name sets, maybe all the mediums and all the larges together in a certain color range, I would save all those down, and you're not going to see me deleting those because I can regenerate them from the original. Until a job was done, the chance of me going back and trying to clean out DST files because I've got individual names under a logo, I'm probably not going to do that. I'm going to save those groupings. I mean, this is a kind of a specialty setup that I'm talking about here, but something like that where I would have multiple stitch files saved off of an existing design setup, I'm not going to worry about deleting those individual stitch files because they're tiny. The amount of storage that a stitch file, a machine formatted file takes is entirely negotiable in the world of modern storage. And so even if let's say that I was only going to generate one file, one machine version file off of one digitized file, I would never go back and say, hey, I've got the original formatted files, I'm not going to save the stitch file also. I'm always going to save the working file and one representative copy of that stitch file somewhere on my drive. Because the other thing is, in the real world, whether it's because there's something that goes on with your equipment that is problematic or something that you do yourself, there's always a chance that even if you're somebody who runs backups, that something happens to the backups and you lose or corrupt your working file. It can happen. Or you do something stupid, you change the working file and save it over top of itself. And unless you have some sort of versioning software doing like your cloud backups, and we'll talk about that in a minute, unless you have backups that are versioned where you can go back and find an older version, you may do something destructive to your file that you want to get back. And if you have at least the stitch file, you have some sort of representative version you can throw on a machine when a customer asks for it, even if you do something horrible to your working file. So I'm never going to get rid of at least the initial representative copy of each file. And frankly, because they're so small, even if I'm generating a bunch of files with a name under them or something, I'm generally going to keep the entire set because it always serves as either a backup for the production to reproduce something I've done before, a backup because something could have happened to the original working file, and if nothing else, it's a historical record of what I output for a job. So there's a lot of reasons why I would not bother with that stuff. What can cost you in storage space, right? Let's talk a little bit about what happens, because sometimes the working files can get quite large. And especially if you do something that I often do when you're saving files, if you do something that I call versioning, certainly it's not just me calling it versioning, but this is not the official versioning that you might see from like a backup system or that you would see as a programmer from someplace where you're committing code and it keeps regimental versions as you go through, or that you might notice from cloud software that does things like, hey, even Google Docs does versioning where you can go back versions and see your changes. Not that kind of versioning, but when you save multiple versions of a file as you are working, when you are doing that, if you do that manually, let's say you don't have this in some kind of controlled environment that does real versioning, right? You can, but like I said, I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that might be a little bit over some folks' head, or at least it's not. If it's not over your head, it might be just deeper than you need to go. If you just save multiple versions of a file, sometimes you can end up with a lot of additional storage space taken up, not because embroidery working files are actually all that large. Usually it happens to be that you're using super high resolution embedded graphics. So what actually costs in storage space, if you're, for some reason, you have small storage space, or maybe you're trying to save space in a backup that you don't want to pay for a huge backup, These days, backups are relatively inexpensive, and for a business, is a cost that I think you should just not worry about too much. But let's say you're trying to keep a hard copy backup and you want this to be, you want a physical backup in two locations, and you're just trying not to constantly have giant, files backed up in it. The one thing that might make something large, or let's say you're trying to email a working file to somebody and there's an email limit, why you're not using a drive or some other large file sending option, I don't know. But let's just say you have to, for some reason, email a working file and it's locking up on the limits. It's usually embedded graphics that causes the problem. So what this means is, especially if you're saving multiple versions of a file, it'll stack up because you have some multi-meg monster file in the background uh, of your design. And if you saved 20 versions of that file and you've got maybe multiple graphics that you put together as reference materials, or as the graphic you're tracing sort of over, that you're drawing your design over, and it's really large, or especially if you grab something at a massive resolution that you really maybe don't need that full resolution and throw that in the background, then those working files can balloon up, and you might be shocked by both how your software might run, depending on the software you're running, and how well it handles really super oversized graphics, and things like how long it takes you to save, or how long maybe autosaves work. I generally don't love autosaves that much. I do a lot of my own saving. It's another thing. I just honestly, I hit the Control S key whenever I'm done creating anything of any import, right? If I create something and I don't want to draw it a second time, is what Lisa always says, save as often as you don't want to do something over again. But I hit that key fairly consistently. Autosave is a nice thing. I don't have it running all the time because I find it is the most likely thing to cause slowdown for you, no matter what software you're running. And for me, I kind of have it as a longer gap between autosaves and as a maybe a backup. But for me, I'm saving so frequently that I really don't worry too much about it. That's just, once again, that's just a habit. Honestly, if I draw anything that was any difficult work whatsoever, on this left hand of mine, I'm hitting the Control S key fairly consistently. So that's the other thing, is I just save a lot. But when we're talking about versioning, when you have multiple versions of a piece, like I'm going to go ahead and just bring this design piece up that I was looking at here. This is the Chambers logo. You guys have seen this a million times, but I did this for a Netflix show, and I did this in Stitch Artist 3. Could have used 2. I was in 3 when I made it. I've got 2 up here on the panel, the tool panel right now. The thing about this is I saved several versions of it, and the final version that I was on, because we were playing with certain elements, I was deciding, hey, do I want to change something here? Do I want to break some things apart? What do I want to do as far as like some of the carving that I did in here? And I had different versions I was working on, as well as because of the very shifty material, we were doing this on puffer coats that had multiple layers. We had some garments that tended to want to shift a lot. I decided to actually kind of center out my text. So you'll actually see, in fact, I'll go ahead and run this back because I discussed it. One of the things that was a version was, originally I was going to run the text kind of right to left and keep it very efficient. I added an extra set of color changes so that I could run the shadows left to right on the right side, then run the text above, and then run the shadows right to left on the left side, and then run the text on top of it. I centered the text out like a cap for a multitude of reasons, but one of them was to maintain this material that was very shifty, and this quilted, very slippery quilted vest that was being used. And so I did that centering out to make sure that those outlines kept their reveals really nicely. But what you're going to notice if you look at my tab up here is this is Chambers V6. So that's 6 files. And I have certainly done pieces where it took more than 6 files. And certainly I've done tons of versions trying to say, hey, maybe I want to change the way this letter looks, but I'm not sure. Or maybe I want to do a new version of this C over here. But rather than just get rid of it, let's just go ahead and make sure that, kill this here. But yeah, let me make sure and save an extra version of that piece. I don't know what I did there. I must have accidentally moved that and done something to delete that at the same time. But I'll just go ahead and change this piece. Instead of just deleting this C and then making a new one, I want to make sure that I've got it somewhere. Certainly you could do the old school thing. What I was actually trying to show you is maybe you move that off to the side, just leave it on the design page, and then make a new version and have them both there. But sometimes if I'm doing something that I've got a fair amount of alteration I'm going to do to some piece, or maybe I'm really going to take a very different direction between the two pieces. Like let's say before this text even hits, I want to save everything that's in the background before the text. All of these elements in the heart, all of these elements in the arrow. I might go ahead and save out that version and say, all right, V1 is up to this level, up to this area, but I might do one of two different things with V2. I might do, one of two things with V3. Or I'll look at this piece and go, okay, I don't like something about it. I'm going to make another version where I change it. So I'll save an entire version over it. The problem is if you're not very careful with how you have your graphics, and you can see here that I do have a graphic here for the jacket back. I'll grab that graphic and run this out so you can see it. This is pretty high resolution, but not crazy. You can see some pixelation, but by all means, you can see the edges of the graphic where it needs to be. I can see how to draw all the elements, and it's not really all that difficult. In fact, let me go ahead and if we kind of crush that transparency down a little bit further and get into digitizing. The good thing is you can see like, okay, I can see my grid marks for the millimeter, and I can see, I can see where the edges of the lines are. I can definitely digitize off of this. It's not going to be a problem. That's decent enough resolution. It does vary depending on the kind of artwork to some degree what that resolution is for you. But I've seen people come in here with super high res images, or and I'm just going to illustrate this as if it were the case, but this is not actually what happened here. They'll come in with a high resolution logo, much larger than they need, and then in the software, they go ahead and grab it and shrink it. Well, if you do that, the software is not then resampling that and saving it at a lower resolution or crushing down the pixels. It's just displaying it very much like vector software at a smaller size, but inside of your working file is still this really huge piece of art. So you can very much, kind of through versioning and through having really extra large, extra high resolution graphics, you can take up more space. So if there is some compelling reason why you don't have a ton of space, then that's the thing that is actually going to cost you the most is probably embedded graphics. And you might want to look at that. Or if you do things like put garments in the background of your images so you can try and you're doing mock-ups in the software of garments with your left chest or what have you, and you've got a really high resolution image of the garment that's hidden, but it's in there in the original graphic. That can also cause your files to be big. So what costs mostly is embedded graphics. I would say never then get rid of the working file. However, if and only if you know that you can summon up that design element, you have saved the original art layer, whatever that is that you're using for tracing. You could go back into versions and delete those out of the files. Or if you're sending your final working file, and I do mean the final working file, off to your client or to somebody, you're preparing a file for them, and you do need for some reason to save a smaller version of the file. Like I said, emailing maybe, though that is not a great reason. You should probably use something like Google Drive or some other drive provider to give them a link to a larger file if you need to. But let's just say you need to, for some reason, you must email them a file and that graphic is too big, it's causing the problem. You can save off a version of that file for export, just save off a new version of the working file. So version that file out, and then you can delete that art out of the piece because you're finished with your digitizing steps, and then send that along if there's a need for it. There's less need for that now. Like I said, storage is cheaper, backup as a service and the cloud is a lot cheaper and a lot more often available for you for less and usually with larger kind of barriers as far as how much we can save. It's not generally going to be the same kind of problem it used to be for us back in the day when we were sending things either on tiny little thumb drives or having to email because that was really the only other option outside of FTP, and not everybody was canny enough to download stuff off of FTP. Then that's a thing to worry about. But usually people are pretty good about using things like Google Drive, which are free to send back and forth reasonably sized files, which is what most embroidery files are going to be. Like I said, I think it's not necessarily the most critical thing to think about, but if you are seeing a bloated file full of stuff, what's often happening is you've got that going on. Or, like I said, if you're seeing poor performance when you're scrolling around and stuff, you could get lesser performance if you have giant images that you're not processing down. So what I would also say is, hey, if you're an embroiderer, it's worthwhile to know enough about graphic software to be able to open up your graphic you're going to be working on, your template graphic, your graphic you're tracing over or working over. Tracing is such a bad word, but that's what a lot of people like to think of it as. The background, not the garment, but the background design that you're working on. If you can grab that, open it up, and save it at a reasonable resolution at the size you are intending to work at, you're going to be happier overall with what you get as far as that behavior, right? So learn enough about how to open up a piece of raster software, whether that's free stuff like the GIMP or you're using something like Adobe Photoshop or Affinity Photo. Go grab that, open it up, save it down at the size you want it to be for the final stitch out, and at a reasonable resolution. 150 to 300 is fine. 150 is usually enough for most things. Certainly, if you want more, you can. But if you have a giant jacket back and you save this sucker at ungodly resolutions, you will have larger files and probably worse performance overall. So I have another comment here that is interesting. Let's see. Number one, Jana says, would you put files in source control? I've thought about it. I haven't done it yet. I'm going to say I've thought about it. So like source control, like you do for programming or what have you, where you would have real versioning, I've thought about it. I have not done so, but I always think about it, especially if you guys know, I do the work for Brilliance on creating libraries, which is something else I'm going to talk about here in a second. Libraries for some of our products like Ace One the Rewind or like Romance or any of those products that we work on. I have created designs that go into those, as has Lisa and certainly Brian. We make designs that go into these big libraries, and versioning would be pretty nice for that. Like when you're working on a really big library file where you have lots of designs involved, I think having real versioning so you could backtrack on it would be awesome. So, like I said, if you're already really canny about that, and you know how to do it. I haven't tried it, but it's certainly an interesting thought. Anyway, Lisa says, yes, I'm sure our control or command S keys are well worn. My whole left-hand corner of the keyboard is well worn, for sure. The left-hand bottom corner, I'm cording all the time. I am constantly using key commands. So if you wonder, even when I use tablet drawing, and I talked about that recently, even when I pick up the pen and I'm doing tablet drawing on the Wacom or whatever I might be using, yeah, the hardware buttons are there, but if I can put a keyboard under my hand somewhere, the muscle memory is so good that I will often do that. So, it is often the case. So let's see. A couple other comments here. Barb says, I save a lot when working. Me too. I save all the time. Doug says, do you delete older versions once you get a good file? I don't. For my money and for my time in the business, I have often had to return to earlier versions, or I have wanted to return to an earlier version of a file to see what's going on, or found out that something I was doing on the machine was actually a problem, not the file, and I wanted to return to an earlier version to see what changes I had made or go back to what I had been doing previously. So I generally tend not to delete older versions. Versions 1 through 6 of that Chambers file are all on my drive. That's me. I'm a little more paranoid about that stuff. If you go through my file formats, you're going to find that in all versions, or all file formats where I've got multiple versions, or even just different alterations or color changes, I often have separate files for everything. But that is because of an overabundance of caution. I've lived through a flooded data room before. I've lived through, lots of damage to things. Even when I had backups, offsite backups, where somehow my backup system managed to chowder a file and then propagate it across all of my cloud backups over time. I had to go back multiple versions to go back and grab stuff, and I've had issues with that before. So for me, having all these versions are very worthwhile, especially if, like, let's say I'm on V6 of a file and all I did was change some sequencing, and then something horrible happens and V6 of the file is trashed. I go back to V5 and maybe I have to do some editing, but not much, or do a little bit of digitizing to finish up, but not much. So for me, I save them for insurance, and also because I frequently use these versions for testing out different aesthetic things, like different treatments to a portion of a design or different changes that I might want to make to stitch types, maybe positioning of something, maybe under style, maybe sequencing, where I might want the other one too. Like if I'm working out a problem, I may want both versions, or I might think something was aesthetically cool about version 3, even though version 6 did something different. And when I want to look up that look for some other file or some other thing, let's say I'm doing a different logo entirely, and I'm like, didn't I do a cool texture on, some version of that Chambers design? I'm going to go look at the versions on that and see what that texture was. I remember it. It's in the back of my head, but I can go look up the texture or get the objects and really copy it out of there immediately. So yeah, I tend to save all of my versions, just how it is. Jesse says you can never save too much. I would have to agree with you. And Barb says I also modified the page caching in Windows. Hey, that's how you do it. You got to get things to work the way you want them to. And certainly I make modifications to my systems quite a bit to make sure that everything is working the way I want to. Haven't had to make any recently, but I have over time. Over time across the years, I certainly have changed a lot about how things run. All right, so very briefly, I just want to kind of talk about some other things really quickly. First thing is just a brief moment to talk about the difference between backup and file sync. So if we're talking about saving our files and making sure we have these safe somewhere, I just want to make sure that we make a difference between these two these two types of things that we might do with our files, right? So when we look at things that are in the modern sphere right now, like OneDrive that Microsoft has installed on everybody's machine, and if you purchase into the OneDrive system, you are syncing your files across all of these folders and both to the OneDrive cloud and perhaps to other computers you might log into with your same OneDrive information. The thing I want you to understand about file sync, though, is if you go to your files and delete something, depending on how things are set up, if you're using file sync like OneDrive, if you go in yourself and delete your files and confirm that you want it deleted, depending on how the system is set up with file sync, it may go in and destructively delete that file from the cloud server and from your other machines as you log in. This is not always the case. The setup can be different, but when you are using services that are doing file sync, what they do is synchronize the drives in all of these different places, which also can include if I save something on top of a file that I didn't intend to and leave it there. Now, certainly these sometimes have versioning and you might be able to reclaim stuff, but the immediate thing that might happen is that you will be stuck looking for an earlier version of the file or having to go find it. And when you go to try and grab your file from the place it should be, it is not there because you deleted it somewhere. It's not always fully destructive where the file is gone. In fact, frequently you've got a version of it or there is a recycle bin that exists even in your cloud server that allows you to reclaim something. But if you go and maliciously try to delete something or somehow just end up continually saving on top of a file, over time, depending on how it's set up, a file sync might propagate that error across all the places it's saved. Whereas a backup, a proper backup, especially a versioned backup system, is saving kind of a snapshot of your files at a certain time. And when you save a new backup, I mean, you may allow backups to age out if that's something you have a limited amount of space where you say, okay, after a certain period of time, I allow an older backup to leave. But if you have a versioned backup or if you have a backup that handles file versioning of some kind, depending on whatever this is, generally, if something is a backup, it's a snapshot in time and it's saving the file and it's non-destructive and it's not just syncing between everything. So like iCloud and OneDrive, they're really file sync. It doesn't mean that they don't have versioning and other options depending on how you have them set up, but they are file sync more than they are backup. Whereas things like Backblaze, traditional backup setups, are there to save that file and kind of lock it down. And different services are going to have different prospects for how those work. I'm not going to go through an entire episode of how to handle backup and file sync right now. I just want you to understand that there's a slight difference and that when you're synchronizing, there's a possibility to change things across all the different systems that you're running. And to at least, even if it's not fully destructive, you can muddle with a file being where it's supposed to be or having what it should have in it. You save something on top of it with the same name, or if you delete a file somewhere, you could have it then propagate that deletion across all those synchronized drives. Whereas a proper backup, a true backup, doesn't do that to save kind of a snapshot of your drive at a certain time. Sometimes it's versioned where it's just it has kind of accumulated changes over time, but there is a way to go back previous to the change you made and get back that design, that file, whatever it is you're trying to get back, previous to the change that you made. Whereas some file sync, depending on how it's set up, depending on what service you're using, may be more destructive, or at the very least may make you have to go look for a version of the file or find it somewhere that's in a temporary jail, a temporary recycle bin until you can get it back. Pardon me drinking there. A little bit of frog in my throat today. So just like I said, this is not a massive thing to discuss. I'm not going to go in through all the different versions or options that are out there. Like I said, things like Backblaze are very common for backup and file sync. A lot of people are using the standard stuff that Apple and Microsoft have out there. We're seeing OneDrive. We're seeing that constantly, and certainly that is fine. It's better to use them than to not use anything at all, to leave it locally stuck on one drive. It's better to use file sync than nothing. Just remember that if you delete something locally, it could also go up to the cloud and delete that file from where you had it or move it from where you had it. And it's not something that's kept in a vault like a backup is. It's not something where you can just go back before the change and fix it. So when you're looking for a solution for that stuff, file sync is awesome. I use it constantly to work on multiple computers on the same files. I think it's useful and it can be useful. The only thing to remember is the second thing you remember about file sync is just because you see something listed on your computer, as far as you go into the file sync folder, your OneDrive folder, and you see all of these file names, look next to it. There's an icon that will generally tell you whether or not it's downloaded locally or not. If there is something that you must have updated that you want to be continually locally available, you can turn on this ability that, hey, this folder, I want everything in this folder instead of just being in the cloud until I request it. So yes, I've got a listing there, but the file isn't really here. It's just an icon and a name until I ask for it, and then it goes up to the cloud to get it, which is the default way that these behave. You can say, hey, in this folder, whenever I turn on this computer, go to the cloud and make sure you've got all of these files. Make sure you've got all the latest versions, sync up this folder every time so that everything is here locally. And the thing that I'm going to say about that also is if you are using software that produces thumbnails for your computer, if you are using software that is going to do some sort of cataloging for your computer, you may find that you have listings that look like a file is on your local drive, but they aren't. It looks like it's inside your file manager, but it's actually up in the cloud, and it will only propagate and create those thumbnails or do whatever cataloging that you have attached to those files when they are locally present on your drive. So go and check. If you're on OneDrive, you can actually see the stuff, whether or not a file is locally available or not. It is just something that's pretty easy to notice. You'll see a little icon. And in fact, I can probably show you something if I can find a piece from it. Like I said, it's just something that I have often discussed. You may see what the status is here, and you can hover over the status and see if something's local or not. And in this case, this is not a folder with embroidery files that I've got here, but just files that are for and I'll show you this real quickly, that are for some Amazon stuff that I'm doing. If you go and look here, you can see, and now my stuff is not huge. You can still kind of see what's going on in the status. You'll see I have little blue clouds, and then I have a green check mark. The little blue clouds mean that though these documents look like they are in this folder here under these Amazon assets, those blue clouds mean it only exists in the cloud right now and is not actually on my system. Whereas the little green check mark means it actually is here on my system. If I click on something with the little green check mark, you'll see the preview pop up. Because I'm not I don't is on the right kind of file format, I'm not going to show the file itself that's here, but you can see that there's a difference between those files. If you need to see a preview of the file, you're going to have to make sure these get to your computer locally. If they are not local, they will not be previewing the way they should or generate thumbnails the way that you might expect. So what I would recommend is if you use file sync and you have a place where you're doing your active digitizing projects and you expect them to be available from multiple computers, then make that folder in OneDrive or whatever software you use, make that folder be a complete local folder so that whenever you log in from whatever machine you're using, it goes, checks that folder, and downloads the current version of all the files that are in your current projects at the very least. For me, because of what I do, I put my entirety of the work of my embroidery work is in that sort of sync. I have a separate backup that is not going to be as volatile as that, but all of the work that I'm currently working on and all of my backed up work that I've worked on before, I have a version of that in a place where it's always going to stay synced between all of my computers. So wherever I pull up, whatever computer I pull up, I can always work on those files. So, like I said, just something to realize about file sync and backup. They have different jobs. Certainly, you can use a file sync system to keep files safer than if they were just sitting on a physical drive in your basement that might or might not get flooded or crushed. But it is worthwhile to take a look at that stuff and make sure you have it set up. Like I said, if you have a way to restore stuff, then it is a much better option. So real backups are still good, even if you use file sync. The people who say that there is no place for file sync, I like file sync just so long as you understand how it works enough and you make it work the way it should for your particular type of project. I don't like to have to continually go and find and instruct my files to download locally. I will have a working area where those files are always going to be synced up. All right. So let's get into kind of the last little stage of this stuff. A couple different things. First, for yourself, when you are trying to kind of catalog things, or you have sets of files that you use for your own systems, for your own workflows, just a couple things I wanted to point out very quickly. If you're somebody who has templated files that you use a lot, and this is certainly something that's specific to Embrilliance to a degree, though there are different types of cataloging software. I'm going to talk about this, libraries and cataloging, right? There's libraries, and then there's cataloging or merge setups, depending on the software that you're in, that can let you see a ton of files all in one place. You can always just arrange files that you consistently use into file folders where you know where they are set up in such a way that they're intelligible and easy to get to, right? So that's always a wonderful thing to do. If you are going to use, let's say you've got one client that has a ton of these frequently used logos that you want to be able to access, or templates that you use all the time for a certain type of product. Let's say you are a gift creator or a monogrammer and you want your templates to be in a certain place. I think there's a couple of ways we can handle that. Certainly, we can do it through cataloging, and that can be either through literally just manually creating file folders that include files of a certain category or use case, and that's great. And you can do that. The other thing you can do, if you have the ability, and in Stitch Artist we have this ability, which is really love, is you can do library creation. And I just wanted to kind of talk about that very briefly. It's not in all levels of Stitch Artist. So let me just very quickly say, if you are an Embrilliance person, a Stitch Artist person, this is going to be Stitch Artist 3 that allows you to do this kind of publication of libraries. But cataloging, and also just using, like I said, if you are arranging things in a way that are useful for you, you have things arranged in a folder where they make sense, you can use like merge functions or something to have an easy preview. So I'll talk about both those really quickly, using Stitch Artist to show it to you. But I just want to say there is an option. If there's something you use all the time, you can actually publish a library and have these in your system. So depending on your software, it may or may not have the ability to use libraries, or you might be literally kind of restricted to just using kind of a workspace or a library space where you just go into a folder that is cataloged and use that. Both of these are viable. I just wanted to very briefly show you the library system because we have that in Stitch Artist, and I found it useful for a couple different things. So just briefly, I'm going to bring in this screen share. If you guys have been around the freebies that are out there, and I know some people are into the whole like Summerween where you do Halloween stuff in the summertime, you might love these little Scully patches. Well, I set these up for free, but the way I set them up was in a library file. What I want to show you very quickly is the way we do this in Stitch Artist is our object tree that's over here isn't just an object tree for one design, it is for the design page. So if you've been in software that's more like, let's say, more like graphics software where you have multiple workspaces, where you can set up workspaces for export, you might think of it kind of like that, right? So when you're doing libraries like this, you actually have multiple designs See up here that there are top level designs, and under each of these designs are the elements that go into each one of those designs. So we have a design level object, and underneath that in the tree are all of the objects that go into creating this individual little patch, right? This skull patch. Now it could be a design, it could be a template, it could be anything. But we now see that we have these different options, right? So we have the happy Scully here, we have our frustrated Scully, we have our amused Scully, we have our dizzy Scully. These are, by the way, available free on the Embrilliance website if you want them. Suffice it to say, these are each named and in a different design level tree object here in the page. So here in the design page, each one of these has a design. I can go up in Stitch Artist 3, and I can go to the Create menu, and I can say Publish, and I can publish designs. And what I can do is create a collection here. Now, this is something that's available. This is not just for, sorry, we had a little blurb there, a little blip on my network. Let's go back on here. You can actually assign an icon to it. You can put the library in there. You can put your file name, your category, and all that stuff. And what that allows you to do is if you have designs you're using consistently, or you have a library of designs or templates that you want to use, you can then use the merged design library setup in Brilliance to go ahead and create those. And you can see that I've got a bunch of stuff that I was using in that I was using for development. So you'll have to ignore some of my junk that I was using for development. But you'll see this little Scully patch and design setup. I've got all of these little patches here. Now, this one actually is from a test that has extra little guys in it that don't belong there, but that was from one of my testing rounds. The cool thing is, in this library, I now have all these different options. And if I want to go into a new file, I can now have this little collection of these here to look at, and then select one and insert it. So if you are consistently making stuff that has a certain template, you can actually publish those yourself. I mean, we have the ones that come with our collection. So if you have something like Ace the Rewind, which is a collection we put out, you guys know from last year, that is still going around. People are using this guy a lot. You can make your own sets of these kinds of setups and these kinds of libraries, so that if you had, let's say, a client that constantly has, like say we're doing a high school, we've got Eldorado Eagles, and they've got the golf, and they have tennis, and they have this, they have that, and they have 4 or 5 different layouts. You can make your own library so that you have a very easy way to insert this stuff, right? So that's something that you can do if you are trying to create your own library of elements and have a very kiosk-like experience. And something that comes with Stitch Artist 3 as far as our collections go. The thing is, like I said, it's not just for collections that we sell. You can actually create these yourself as well. And I've got several ones that I've done. Now I'm showing you some of these from our setup, but some of them are also just my testers and stuff like that. So like I said, you can create these. And in these Halloween designs, you see this one Lisa created for everybody, which is a collection of some of our old Halloween patches and some of the stuff I made for her too. This the little black cat guy is one of these patch setups as well. So like I said, you can create your own template setups like that, and it's something that can be quite useful. Certainly, I think the one that looks more like what I would probably end up using in this case is our envelope designs. I'll go ahead and grab those real quickly, where you might say, okay, I have these layouts that I use all the time. I'm going to kind of codify these, put these in one page, and produce a library so that I can very easily create a setup that I'm always able to use whenever I want to. So like I said, something interesting that you can do. But the other thing that is also entirely possible is to use merges or catalogs and just have your stuff set up in a way that is easy to locate. Certainly, there's other options for that, and stuff that's out there to do more cataloging, and things on the horizon to make more cataloging happen. But a good to start is just to organize your files and have them where you want them per the use, and that can help. Certainly, doing more fine-grained cataloging is great, but even if you just are using a file insert function, you can often get a similar kind of catalog feel from doing that too. So I think it is worthwhile just to think, hey, if I've got stuff that I'm constantly going to be using, is there a way for me to handle that? And certainly you can use cataloging or insert functions or those kind of workspaces. Or if you have Stitch Artist 3, if you're a Brilliance person, you can make your own library so that you open up your software, and without going and finding things in a catalog, you can actually set up use-based libraries I find it's actually very nice to do that. Like I said, a kiosk-like setup for if you have people working under you or with you who don't need to access the entirety of uh, the design catalog that you have, or go through everything that you might use, that they can just go ahead and go directly to a small subset of stuff that is made specifically for a particular client or what have you. So just something else to think about if you're doing something local, that libraries and cataloging, either just organizing yourself or using cataloging, can be helpful for making your production process a little easier to handle, and certainly for having people help you along the line. So, something to think about, something worthwhile, and hopefully something you might find some use to. And last but not least, the thing that I got other questions about certainly was in the process of creating a file release product. So we'll cover this very quickly. It's something that I talked about earlier when I was discussing not only pricing and digitizing and pricing, but how people handle files and file ownership. And in that conversation, we certainly had a little bit of churn where people were saying, "Hey, I don't release my files. I do release my files. Here's why I don't, what have you." And in this case, it really depends on how you want to handle that, what involvement you'll have with this. But I showed everybody my kind of rigmarole for this thing. Number one, my reasoning for why I do release files. And then secondly, number two, how I release files when I do, as somebody who digitized in-house for a decoration company. First, why I release files, I'll just very shortly reiterate it. By the time somebody is asking for the file to take off, if they are leaving after some sort of scuffle, the chance of them, coming back to you if you dig your heels in and tell them, no, you can't have the file, not real high anyway. It's a limited usefulness. Whereas if during the process you let them know, hey, I'm willing for you to have your file. When you want to come back, I'd love for you to come back. That's fantastic. If they've paid for the file, if that's something that's not part of your pricing structure and you're okay with that, I think more it is much more valuable, or has been more valuable to me, to literally just go ahead and let them have that file, because there's more goodwill that's there, and there's much more chance that they might come back to you if they're leaving for some other reason. Especially if they're bargain hunting, it's like I've said many times, they're bargain hunting, they're going to a place where someone else is not covering what they should be in their costs. They'll be back to you in 6 months anyway. And frankly, also, bargain hunters shouldn't be the people we're trying desperately to hold on to anyway. They're the worst clients. And I don't mean that they're bad people, but they are the lowest value clients out of our stable always. We'd rather have people who want to be with us and who are willing to pay. That is just the honest truth. Now, the second thing is, how do I handle this process of releasing my files? Number one, I guess A and B, since I'm already on number two. A, how do I release these files? If they do not want to pay, if they are not looking for anything more than to get out, it's somebody who I'm not particularly keen on trying to, maintain more than just basic goodwill, I'm going to give them the bare DST machine file. So I will let them have the machine file as it is with no additional information, and I'll let them run with that file, right? So I will just say, hey, this is the file that you have. It doesn't have any additional information in it. It just has the design as it's going to run on a machine, and you're going to have to select color your new shop. That is between you and them, which colors they have on file. Now, frankly, they may or may not have the same thread colors anyway, but they're going to have to do the small amount of effort of maintaining that, of making sure that they have the right file, and making sure they have the colors in order, and doing their initial sample too. I'm not handing over a new sample. I'm not handing over my canonical sample from my files. I'm not creating anything else but handing them, or literally shooting them an email DST file in it. That's what they get if they don't want to have anything more than that. The other thing I will offer to people, if they are the other kind of client which has asked me for files, the other type of client that asks for files pretty frequently that is not a bargain hunter is a corporate client, where they often are required to kind of corral these resources and have them on a local server or have them in-house. I've had multiple corporate clients and large organizations where when you have a file prepared, they are required with their purchase to get some sort of deliverable that they can take in-house. It doesn't mean you have to give them your working file, but they often want that deliverable. And if you have a client like that, or if you have somebody who's leaving on either good terms or just wants to take this to do something else and they are happy to pay for the rest of the service, you offer them what I call kind of a file release package or a product. And the great thing about this is instead of waiting until somebody asks for a file to do this, I offer these ahead of time. I'm like, if you would like your file and you need to keep a local copy of your file yourself, there are two options. I can email you the bare machine file that doesn't have any other information in it, or we have a package that I can give you. Here's another $50. Here's another whatever you want to charge for that. And I will present to them one stitch sample, likely, and the file on some sort of hard media is what we used to do. We may not do that right now. We might have a downloadable version and a copy, a PDF or a printed version of the final print file. So the design with centering marks as previewed with the color stops listed in that file. And depending on what we've done for the folks, if it's something where I'm generating something more than that, and sometimes you can even do an additional upcharge. If you've worked on art for them, you can say, also, here's your vector, and here's a list of the fonts and colors that we used in your print. So here's also Pantone colors, and maybe here are font names for the fonts that we used, and that's more of almost a style guide thing. So producing a file release product is another way that we can, honestly, we can take this whole concept of I need to have my file and turn it into a product that we can get paid for. And we can decide how much we want to charge for that. We can also decide how far we want to go in the production of that file. So I'll show you an old one that I did, as well as kind of discuss this really quick. Throw this up on my, pardon me, on my gallery so you can kind of see that. And just to show you kind of what we're dealing with, certainly number one, I'm going to say in-house, how did we handle our files and file management? We had a localized system. In this case, is an old version of ShopWorks, but it still suffices to show you what's going on. Every one of our jobs had a saved preview of the design, and it had a thread color lineup with stitches, locations, height, width, design code. And depending on how your system works, it probably also had a storage. Ours did not. We had our file storage done separately and linked. This, you can have servers that also contain the stitch file itself, or have stitch files that are generated by the system, depending on the system you're using, that are maintained, especially ones that generate naming, right? Which is not a lot, but some do. Especially some of the online ones that have engines that do that, they can do that. But in this case, files and the formatting and all that were saved. That's what we did for our local files, as well as having them in catalogs. But the thing we can prepare, and often prepared people had, generally would have a sample set. And you can see this is kind of like the sample set. In fact, these were presented. I accidentally got the wrong picture for this. These were presented for this particular client. We did it both as both for them to have a package with their file and as a sample set, because we were doing really high-end and specialty threads. We were running all rayon for these folks and special color combinations. In this case, these were done as cut cards. So we had samples on garment dyed jersey knit, and they were shipped in cut window cards. So have you ever seen like kind of the window cards you might get for, sometimes you'll see them done for greeting cards where you have a fabric insert. We used to use those to make these high-end production packages for people sometimes. It's not for everybody. Most people, you're getting, a printed version of it with your color changes. But for certain clients, we would have sample cards like this, and then they would get something similar to this. Now, this is one that was generated from the company Black Duck where I worked, and you can see this is This is what we did in production, but it's the same kind of thing that we would send them. It would be a file that had a centering mark, and then it would have color stops. And I'll show you in Stitch Artist what that is like in a moment. And like I said earlier, if something more extensive, and this one we did a mock-up, or I did a mock-up of a Black Duck style guide, but I'll just zoom in so you can kind of see the kind of things we're talking about, where you might have a version of the logo vector that we had done. This one is a more full and complete style guide that has extra information, but just a version of the logo in vector that has the fonts used in the logo type and the colors used indicated. This one is set up much more like a brand guide that has things like placing requirements and stuff like that. I'm not suggesting all of that, but I have done something both in embroidery and for print/embroidery, where I will give somebody the layout files and give them font names as well as the color numbers and the eventual design. When I do that, though, this is then sold as a product. That was not how we ever did that for free. For free, you get a bare DST file. I mean, something like what we have down here, where you got the generated file is one set, but instead you get the DST, and it is contains no colors, has no information, is nothing else but the existing file. And this is an old thing that I set up for a logo system. But suffice it to say, just to kind of explain what I'm talking about, there are ways we can kind of justify this and manage those files in a way that we can make them into a product that is useful for us. So, like I said, I'll just very briefly, I thought I would show you what that kind of looks like in Brilliance as well, so you can see what I'm talking about. And how we would do it is to print to PDF. There's two different tools that I would use to create the things I want. Number one, I would often also give them a flat graphic of the file in a 3D preview. If you are in the Brilliance world, you're going to want to have Enthusiast for that. I'm going to show that to you here in a second. So let's go ahead and bring that up. If I wanted to create a preview graphic of this that I was going to send them or put into a digital package, I would go up here to my to my utilities, and I would go to save image here. And in this case, because I want to give them a fairly high resolution graphic of it, I would very likely give them either a transparent PNG version of that. It's going to let them make layouts for, let's say they're internally going to handle like e-commerce or maybe a company store. It's something where I'm not going to be doing that. Then they might want to have that preview. I would give them a 300 DPI transparent version of this. And I like to put like a 5% border on that to give a little clear space around it in case they were using this for like layouts, like I said, doing mock-ups with garments. So I would generally save that off. In this case, I'll just say okay and save it. We don't need to go through the process of actually saving it, but that's what I would do. So we would produce that. And then thing I would do is I'm going to go ahead and go here to print preview. The other thing I would generally offer them is this version. We've got the final version of the piece, and it does have the crosshairs here, so it shows the centering on the file. And then the second page that's going to be on here is going to have the color blocks, and it shows you by highlighting each individual color, the color blocks that are in the individual piece. So in this case, I don't have thread colors assigned to these correctly, so they're not showing correctly, but I would have the assigned thread colors on this. In fact, I'll go over to the Chambers logo and let's do another version of that. Let's go ahead and go to the print preview on this guy, and then we can see a little bit better. Here's our Chambers logo. We'll zoom in on that. We can see that it has the centering marks, so you can find your crosshairs there. And then on this piece, you can now see a little bit better the color chips, since I actually assigned correct colors to it instead of leaving the original vector colors I was converting out of. In this case, you can see named Madeira colors that are easy to find and individual items that are highlighted from this piece. You can see what those color changes are in the file and how I would handle that for sending that digitally or creating a digital copy of this. Even if I did hard copy, whatever physical media that I sent along would also have PDFs of these other files. It would have the preview and it would have PDF versions of this and or any style guide like the one I just showed you. But in this case, generally, I would be very easy with this stuff. I'd go ahead and go to print this. And when I went to print it, I would just use Microsoft Print to PDF. I mean, just as easy as anything to use Print to PDF and save off a PDF version of this for the client to then be able to use. So if I did that, I would just say, okay, file, print preview, make sure all your stuff is set up correctly the way you want it. Go ahead, go to print to PDF, save that off, and then let's call that, in this case, we have this chamber design prep that I already did. I'm going to go ahead and open that sucker so you can see it. So I'm going to open that in Sumatra PDF, and you'll see that's now what I actually have to send off to them, and they can actually take a look at this. They can zoom in, get themselves a decent look at that centering mark. They'll see what the 3D preview looks like, and then they'll have the individual color chips that they can go off of, as well as the sequencing of where that color is in the design. So like I said, this is something you're not going to do for everybody, but in the case that you do have a client that is trying to get that file from you and they're willing to do that, or they're a corporate client that has to have some sort of physical deliverable or digital deliverable that has to be on their servers because they paid for it, making a product out of it so that you can at least justify your time is wonderful. And honestly, having something like that in your own files is incredibly useful producing something like that is great to back up with your client files so that you can always use that to produce their garments in down the road, or if they need to get those files. I'll say with backup, as cheap as it is, I think creating this stuff and having a backup of all customer files, even as just as a digitizer, especially, in fact, not even, but as a digitizer, especially if you're an outsourced digitizer, having part of your offering be that you have a backup in perpetuity of every file you've ever made in case your client has some catastrophic thing happen to their backups of files is a wonderful thing as well. So even if you're not a decorator, very worth it to make sure things are backed up and to save all of that information so you've got it in multiple formats as it is needed. So, all right, folks. Like I said, record everything. Make sure you've got your cloud backup solution in hand. Understand the difference between backup and file sync. And by all means, like I said, know the working file versus the stitch file, what they're useful for. Never, 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 never delete file. Keep that thing forever. As far as file storage goes, when you do have large items in your file storage, check out what it is that's costing. Generally, what's costing you that space is embedded graphics, especially if you've saved many, many versions with large embedded graphics in them. Think about preparing your graphic for the process of digitizing before you do it. And if you absolutely must send something, you can always delete that big embedded graphic out of it. Once again, last but not least, if you do want to see me in that podcast about earlier or hear me talk, you're not done. An hour and a half wasn't enough for you, you poor, poor things. Go ahead and check out that episode 52 of Threads of Change. I'll go ahead and throw the QR code back up just for a minute again if you want to see it. And then I will grab that for you so you can go ahead and check that out. If not, look up Threads of Change or Repair List and my name, you'll get it. Also, if you're on YouTube right now, in the community posts, I posted that up there for you as well. And once again, I guess I would say this, but one more time, if you want some of those free files or libraries, remember I told you about libraries and catalogs. If you would like to see some cool libraries, go over to the Embrilliance website. So go over to embrilliance.com. And in fact, I'm going to grab you right now, live while we're sitting here. I'm going to get the Embrilliance Scully library for you so that you can check those out. And download those yourself. Since I showed you those and they are out there, there might as well be something. So let me get those free Scully patches for you. Let me grab that link and we show that on screen for you right now. If you would like to get these little Scully patches and download a library and see what it's like to have a little library and input those, you can grab those from this link right here, and I will throw that on a banner and in the comments. You can grab those as well. Since I showed it to you, I might as well give you a chance at them if you want them. And if you're someone who does the whole summer ween thing, well, there you go. There's your summer ween. Enjoy it if you want to, as weird as that sounds sometimes. If you enjoy it and you want to do some spooky stuff, go get some spooky skulls on me. I'd love to see people using them more often. All right, folks, with that, I'm going to let you go for the week. But like I said, think about your file storage, think about where you save stuff. And as Lisa always says, hey, save things as often as you don't want to redo them. And as I say, they're saved somewhere that's not just the computer that's sitting in front of you. All right, folks, thank you for being here, and I can't wait to see you again next week.